Part 1 and on. On the far edge of known space, where stars grew thin and silence stretched for light years, there floated a small human colony called Epsilon 9. It was not famous. It was not rich. It was not even on most star charts. If you asked a trader from the Galactic Concord about it, they would probably shrug and say they had never heard of it. And if they had, they would call it useless. Epsilon 9 orbited a dim red star that had long since cooled from its fiery youth. The planet below was dry, rocky, and covered in rust-colored dust. There were no oceans, no forests, no cities, just domes, about 200 of them, scattered across a flat basin like bubbles on old soap. Inside those domes lived fewer than 2,000 people. Most were farmers who coaxed food from hydroponic trays. Others were mechanics who kept the air recyclers running. A few were teachers, doctors, or retired engineers who had chosen quiet over comfort. The colony had no army, no warships, no fancy shields or laser turrets. Its only ship in orbit was an old cargo hauler named the Linden. It had been built to carry grain, not fight battles. Its hull was patched in a dozen places. Its engines sputtered when cold, and its comms array barely reached the next star system. The Linden's captain, a woman named Helen Cho, spent her days checking cargo manifests and fixing leaky oxygen lines. She had never fired a weapon in her life. The governor of Epsilon 9 was a man named Carl Briggs. He was in his late 50s with thinning gray hair and hands rough from years of fixing things himself. He didn't wear a uniform. He wore a faded blue jumpsuit with grease stains on the knees. He didn't give speeches. He settled arguments over water rations and made sure the children's school tablets had enough battery. He was not a leader in the grand sense, just a man who cared deeply about the people around him. Life on Epsilon 9 moved slowly. Mornings began with the hum of air filters and the soft beep of algae vats signaling a full harvest. People walked to their jobs without hurry. There were no sirens, no alarms, no news feeds shouting about wars or politics. The colony had cut most ties with Earth decades ago, not out of anger but out of distance. Messages took weeks to arrive. By the time Earth replied, the problem was usually already solved. This quiet existence made Epsilon 9 invisible, and in the galaxy, being invisible was often the same as being safe. But that changed on a Tuesday. It started with a flicker in the long-range sensors, tiny, almost missed. Helen Cho was sipping coffee in the Linden's cramped cockpit when the alert pinged. At first she thought it was a glitch. Sensor ghosts were common out here, caused by solar flares or cosmic dust. But then the flicker became a shape, then many shapes. She called Carl Briggs immediately. He arrived at the comms hub 10 minutes later, still wiping engine grease from his fingers. On the main screen, a cluster of dark blips hung just beyond the system's outer edge. They were not human. Their signatures were jagged, aggressive, unlike anything in the Concord database. Carl didn't panic. He never did. He just leaned closer to the screen and asked, "How long until they reach orbit?" 6 hours, Helen said, her voice steady but tight. Carl nodded. He turned to the small group that had gathered. Leo Grant, a wiry mechanic with oil under his nails. Maya Ruiz, the colony's botanist who always carried a data pad full of plant growth charts. And a few others. None of them were soldiers. None had ever seen real combat. "Do we send a message?" Leo asked. Carl shook his head. "They're not here to talk." He was right. Within the hour, a transmission crackled through the comms, a deep, guttural voice speaking in broken standard. It came from a species known as the Krellians. They were conquerors, ruthless. They had burned dozens of worlds, enslaved entire populations, and left nothing but ash in their wake. Their message was simple: surrender your colony or be erased. Silence filled the room. Maya looked at the floor. Leo clenched his jaw. Helen stared at the screen like it might bite her. Carl didn't move for a long moment. Then he walked to the back of the hub, where an old console sat covered in dust. It hadn't been touched in years, not since the last drill. He wiped the screen with his sleeve, entered a code, and pressed a red button beneath a cracked plastic cover. A low, deep tone echoed through every dome, every hallway, every home. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The colony's emergency horn, more myth than machine, had sounded for the first time in living memory. People stopped what they were doing. Children looked up from their lessons. Farmers paused over their trays. Mechanics set down their tools. Everyone knew what the horn meant. Not because they had been told, but because they had all been part of the same quiet ritual once a year, the maintenance drill. It wasn't called a defense drill. That would have drawn attention, so they called it maintenance. Once a year, everyone would gather in their sector and practice system checks. They would open hidden panels, test dormant circuits, and run simulations on old terminals. Most thought it was just bureaucracy, a way to keep old systems from rusting, but Carl knew better. Years ago, before he became governor, he had been part of a secret Earth program, one so buried it had no name. The idea was simple: scatter tiny hidden defense grids across the most forgotten colonies. Not to start wars, but to survive them. Each grid was tied to a single activation signal, the horn, and each person on the colony unknowingly held a piece of the puzzle in their yearly drills. Now the horn had sounded. Carl walked back to the main screen. The Krellian fleet was moving closer. Their ships were massive, black, and covered in weapon ports. They looked like teeth in the void. He turned to Helen. "Get the Linden ready," she blinked. "Ready for what?" "For whatever comes next." Outside, the red sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the domes. Inside, people moved with quiet purpose. No one screamed. No one ran. They opened panels in their walls, tapped codes into dusty keypads, and waited. They were not soldiers, but they were ready. And the Krellians, watching from their warships, saw only a weak, helpless colony. They did not see the thousands of tiny eyes waking up beneath the dust. They did not hear the hum of dormant machines powering on. They did not know that Earth's weakest colony had been waiting for this moment all along. In 6 hours, the assault would begin, but Epsilon 9 would not fall. Not in 6 hours. Not in 15 minutes. Part 2. The horn's echo faded, but its effect did not. Across Epsilon 9, people moved with calm urgency. No one shouted. No one cried. They had practiced this moment every year, though none had believed it would ever be real. Now it was, and they trusted the routine more than they feared the unknown. Leo Grant walked quickly back to his workshop, a dome near the eastern edge of the settlement. Inside, tools hung neatly on magnetic strips, and half-finished engine parts sat on workbenches. But beneath the floor, hidden under a false panel, was something else. He knelt, pulled the panel open, and revealed a smooth black console. Dust floated in the air as he wiped it clean. His fingers moved over the keys without hesitation. A soft green light blinked to life. The system was online. In another dome, Maya Ruiz stood in her greenhouse, surrounded by rows of glowing green plants. She tapped her datapad, and the walls around her shifted. Panels slid aside, revealing sleek interfaces built into the greenhouse frame. Vines and wires intertwined, but the tech beneath was sharp and ready. She entered her access code, and the colony's atmospheric control grid linked to her station. She could now adjust wind patterns, ion density, even temperature spikes across the entire basin. It wasn't for farming anymore. It was for defense. High above, aboard the Linden, Helen Cho worked fast. The old cargo hauler groaned as hidden compartments unfolded along its hull. What had looked like storage bays now revealed railgun mounts and sensor arrays. Nano-weave armor, stored in gel form for years, flowed across the ship's skin like liquid metal, hardening into a protective shell. The AI core, dormant since installation, woke with a low hum. Its voice was calm, almost gentle. "Defense protocol active, awaiting command." Helen sat in the pilot's seat, her hands steady on the controls. She had never flown in combat, but she knew every bolt, every circuit, every backup system on this ship. It was hers. And today it would fight. Back in the comms hub, Carl Briggs monitored everything. Screens flickered with data from every sector. Drone silos were powering up. Power grids were rerouting energy to shield emitters. Water reservoirs were being converted into coolant for laser capacitors. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was random. Every system had a purpose, and every person had a role. The Krellians still thought they were attacking a farming colony. They had no idea that every dome, every greenhouse, every garage was part of a single silent weapon. Carl opened a channel to all residents. His voice was quiet but clear. "Remember your drills. Stay at your stations. Trust the system. And don't stop until it's over." No one replied. They didn't need to. They were already working. Outside, the ground trembled slightly, not from an earthquake, but from the awakening of the drone silos buried deep beneath the surface. Metal doors split open in the dust, and thousands of small black drones rose into the air like a swarm of insects. They hovered for a moment, then scattered in perfect formation, some toward orbit, some along the surface, others into the upper atmosphere. Each was no bigger than a hand, but each carried micro-payloads, EMP charges, signal jammers, thermal lures. The Krellian fleet, now only 2 hours from orbit, began launching dropships. Dozens of them peeled away from the capital vessels, streaking toward the planet like falling knives. Their hulls glowed red from atmospheric friction. Inside, Krellian warriors, tall, armored, and armed with plasma rifles, prepared to storm the surface. They expected little resistance. Maybe a few panicked shots, maybe a surrender broadcast. They did not expect silence. As the first dropship hit the upper atmosphere, the drones struck. It wasn't a single explosion. It was 1,000 tiny disruptions. EMP bursts fried the dropship's navigation. Jamming signals scrambled its comms. Thermal lures pulled its targeting systems off course. The ship wobbled, then spiraled. It never reached the ground. It broke apart 50 kilometers up, scattering debris like ash. The second dropship fared no better. Atmospheric processors, controlled by Maya, released a sudden burst of ionized gas. The air itself became a conductor. Electricity arced across the ship's hull, overloading its power core. It exploded in a flash of blue light. On the Krellian command ship, the admiral growled in confusion. "What is this? Who are these humans?" His sensors showed no large weapons. No fleet, no army. Just a quiet planet and a swarm of bugs. He ordered full bombardment. If they could not land, they would burn the colony from orbit. But as the capital ships turned their main cannons toward Epsilon 9, the Linden moved. Helen didn't wait for orders. She pushed the throttle forward, and the old hauler shot upward faster than it had ever flown. Railguns along its sides fired in rapid sequence, not at the ships, but at their weapon ports. Tiny, high-velocity slugs struck with pinpoint accuracy, jamming turrets before they could fire. The Krellians returned fire, but their shots passed through empty space. The Linden danced between plasma bolts, its AI calculating evasive paths faster than any human could. Helen trusted it completely. She focused on one thing: keeping the fleet distracted long enough for the surface grid to finish its work. Below, Carl watched the energy readings climb. The planetary shield was almost ready. It wasn't a dome of light like in old movies. It was invisible. A web of magnetic fields and charged particles woven from geothermal vents, solar collectors, and recycled reactor cores. It wouldn't stop a direct hit forever, but it would buy time. And time was all they needed. Leo, from his workshop, sent a command. The drone swarm split into 2 groups. One continued harassing the dropships. The other flew straight at the Krellian capital ships. They didn't try to destroy them. They crawled over the hulls, seeking vents, seams, antenna arrays. Once attached, they injected code. Simple, brutal viruses designed to lock systems, drain power, or trigger false alarms. Inside the Krellian ships, chaos spread. Lights flickered. Doors sealed randomly. Weapon systems rebooted mid-cycle. Warriors shouted at consoles that no longer responded. The Admiral slammed his fist on the command console. "This is impossible. They are farmers." But they weren't just farmers. They were engineers, programmers, botanists, mechanics, people who understood systems. And they had turned their entire world into one. Maya adjusted the atmosphere again. This time, she pulled moisture from deep aquifers and released it high above the colony. The sudden humidity mixed with ionized particles, creating a dense electrical storm. Lightning crackled across the sky, not natural but guided. It struck the nearest Krellian dropship like a whip, melting its thrusters. On the ground, children helped too. From their school domes, they used their learning tablets to feed real-time terrain data into the drone network. Their small hands tapped coordinates, marked safe zones, flagged enemy movements. They weren't scared. They were part of the machine. The Krellian admiral finally understood. This wasn't a battle. It was a trap, and his fleet was already inside it. He ordered a retreat, but it was too late. The planetary shield activated fully. A soft hum filled the air, felt more than heard. The sky shimmered for a split second, then returned to normal. But when the Krellian cannons fired again, their blasts dissipated harmlessly against the invisible barrier. Helen, still in orbit, watched the enemy ships turn to flee. She didn't chase them. She just held position, the Linden humming beside her like a guard dog. Back on the surface, Carl exhaled. The first wave was over. The colony stood, not because of weapons or warriors, but because of preparation, trust, and quiet determination. No one cheered. No one celebrated. They simply returned to their stations, ready for the next move, because they knew the Krellians might come back, and if they did, Epsilon 9 would be waiting. By 3, the Krellian fleet did not retreat. Not yet. Their admiral, proud and furious, refused to believe that a colony of farmers had stopped his warships. He ordered a second wave, bigger, faster, angrier. This time they would not land gently. They would break the sky open and pour fire onto the surface until nothing moved. At 08:03 local time, the first new dropship tore through the upper atmosphere. It was larger than the others, armored with layered plating and bristling with weapons. Inside, elite Krellian shock troops stood ready, their eyes fixed on the planet below. They expected resistance. They got something else. Before the dropship could stabilize, a storm of micro-drones hit it from all sides. These were not the same as before. These carried shaped charges, tiny, focused explosives designed to punch through weak points. They struck the ship's thruster vents, its sensor arrays, its landing gear. Metal screamed as joints buckled. The dropship tilted, then spun wildly. It never reached the ground. At 8:05, it exploded in a ball of orange flame, scattering burning debris across the upper sky. The second dropship tried to adjust. It flew lower, hugging the terrain, hoping to avoid the drones. But Maya Ruiz had already rerouted the colony's weather grid. She triggered a sudden downdraft over the eastern flats, a wall of wind so strong it flipped the ship sideways. As it struggled to correct, drones swarmed its underbelly, disabling its repulsor lifts. It crashed into a dry riverbed and broke apart on impact. No survivors crawled from the wreckage. On the Krellian command ship, alarms blared. The admiral roared at his officers. Target their power sources. Find their reactors. But Epsilon 9 had no central reactor. Its power came from dozens of small buried units, solar taps, geothermal wells, kinetic harvesters buried in the dust. There was no single point to destroy. The colony was built to survive, not to shine. Meanwhile, the Linden held its position in low orbit. Helen Cho watched the enemy fleet through narrowed eyes. She saw their pattern now. They fired in salvos, paused to cool weapons, then fired again. In that pause, she acted. She sent a command to the orbital drone net, silent, waiting since activation. Hundreds of drones detached from the Linden's hull and streaked toward the Krellian capital ships. They didn't attack. They latched on like ticks and began feeding false data into the enemy sensors. Suddenly, the Krellians saw phantom ships, fake asteroids, even illusions of their own fleet turning on them. Confusion spread through their command channels. Back on the surface, Leo Grant coordinated the ground swarm from his workshop. His screen showed every drone, every energy spike, every enemy movement. He didn't think like a soldier. He thought like a mechanic. Find the weak part, apply pressure, break it cleanly. He ordered a group of drones to target the Krellians' comms relays. Within seconds, the enemy dropships lost contact with their command ship. They were blind, alone, and flying into a trap. One by one, they fell. A third dropship tried to land near the central dome. It made it through the atmosphere, its thrusters roaring as it descended. But just before touchdown, the ground beneath it shifted. Hidden plates opened, and magnetic coils fired upward, yanking the ship off balance. It slammed into the dirt, its hull cracking open. Before the Krellian warriors could exit, gas vents released a non-lethal neuroinhibitor, developed years ago for riot control. The invaders collapsed unconscious before they could raise their weapons. Carl Briggs watched from the comms hub. His face was calm, but his hands were tight on the edge of the console. He knew this wouldn't last forever. The Krellians had more ships, more firepower, but he also knew something they didn't. Epsilon 9 wasn't fighting to win a war. It was fighting to survive 15 minutes, and they were already halfway there. At 08:10, the Krellian admiral lost patience. He ordered his main cannons to fire directly at the colony's surface, shield or not. Massive plasma beams lanced down from orbit, bright enough to blind. But the planetary shield held. It rippled like water under the impact, absorbing, dispersing, redirecting the energy into the ground, where it was safely bled off through conductive channels built into the bedrock. The domes shook, but none broke. Lights flickered, then steadied. Helen saw her chance. While the Krellian ships were focused on bombardment, their flanks were exposed. She angled the Linden and fired its main railgun, not at the hull but at the weapon mounts. One slug struck the primary cannon assembly of the lead ship. Sparks erupted. The cannon overheated and detonated, tearing a hole in the Krellian vessel's side. The admiral finally understood. This was not a battle he could win with force. Every move he made was countered before it landed. Every advantage he thought he had was already neutralized. His warriors were falling. His ships were damaged. His pride was bleeding. At 0816, he gave the order to withdraw. But Epsilon 9 wasn't done. As the Krellian fleet turned to flee, the drone swarm launched its final phase. They didn't chase. They waited. And when the enemy ships passed through a specific orbital path, carefully calculated by the colony's AI, the drones released their last payload, signal mirrors. These tiny devices bounced the Krellians' own comms and radar back at them in chaotic loops. For a few critical seconds, the fleet saw only noise. Navigation failed. Engines misfired. Two ships collided in the confusion. By 0818, the last Krellian warship limped out of orbit, its hull scorched, its crew silent. The sky cleared. The drones returned to their silos. The shield powered down. The wind settled. On the surface, people stepped out of their domes. They looked at the sky, then at each other. No one spoke. There was no cheering, no shouting, just quiet relief. Leo wiped sweat from his brow and shut down his console. Maya checked her plants. Some leaves were singed from the ion storms, but they would grow back. Helen guided the Linden into a stable orbit and ran a damage report. Minor hull breaches. 2 drones lost. Everything else functional. Carl walked outside and stood in the red dust. He looked up at the stars, knowing the Krellians would tell others what happened here. They would say a ghost colony destroyed their fleet. They would say humans were not to be underestimated. He smiled faintly. They had held. Not with guns or glory, but with preparation, patience, and the simple will to protect home. 15 minutes had passed, and Earth's weakest colony had won. Part 4. 3 days after the battle, the sky over Epsilon 9 was clear again. The red sun rose and set as it always had. The dust settled. The domes hummed with the quiet rhythm of daily life. Outside, farmers returned to their hydroponic trays. Mechanics patched minor damage to surface vehicles. Children played near the irrigation lines, laughing as they chased each other through the thin air. To anyone watching, it looked like nothing had happened. But the Galactic Concorde was watching. Their observer ship, the Wayfarer, arrived without fanfare. It was small, white, and unarmed. A vessel of peace, not war. It hovered in high orbit for hours, scanning, recording, analyzing. When it finally sent a shuttle down, only 2 envoys stepped out. A tall, silver-scaled diplomat named Vex and a human liaison named Nora Bell. They wore soft robes and carried no weapons. They came not to inspect but to understand. Carl Briggs met them at the main airlock. He wore the same faded blue jumpsuit now patched at the elbow. He offered them water, real water, not recycled, and led them through the colony without ceremony. He showed them the domes, the algae vats, the school. He did not show them the hidden panels, the drone silos, or the shield emitters buried beneath the soil. Those were not for visitors. Vex asked few questions. His large eyes took in everything. The worn tools, the hand-painted signs on storage units, the way people nodded to Carl as he passed. He had expected ruins, or at least signs of panic. Instead, he found calm, order, normalcy. How? He finally asked, his voice a low hiss. Your colony had no military presence. No fleet, no recorded defenses. Yet you destroyed a Krellian task force in minutes. Carl shrugged. We just defended our home. Nothing special. Nora Bell, who had grown up on Mars and knew human stubbornness well, smiled faintly. She had seen footage from the battle. It wasn't nothing. It was everything. But she said nothing. She let the silence speak. Later in the comms hub, the conquered envoys were shown the raw data. Not the edited version, but the full log. Every drone movement, every energy spike, every command sent from workshop consoles and greenhouse pads. Vex watched, stunned, as the colony's defense unfolded like a machine with no center, yet perfect coordination. There were no generals, no central command barking orders, just people doing what they had practiced, trusting the system and each other. This was not chance, Vex said slowly. This was design, Carl nodded. We prepared. That's all. But the Concorde knew better. Back on their ship, analysts replayed the battle again and again. They studied how the drones moved in patterns that defied standard swarm logic. How the atmospheric interference matched no known weather model. How the Linden, a cargo hauler, had fought like a warship. They saw the truth. Epsilon 9 had not just survived. It had outthought, outmaneuvered, and outlasted a superior force with nothing but ingenuity and quiet resolve. Word spread fast. Within a week, other species began asking questions. The Xanthari, known for their honor duels, sent a message of respect. The Orlan traders, who avoided war zones like plague, rerouted their routes to pass near Epsilon 9, not to trade, but to see for themselves. Even the Krellians, though silent, stopped raiding near human space. Rumors grew that they now called Epsilon 9 the Silent Maw, a place that swallowed fleets whole. On Earth, the Strategic Defense Directorate held a closed-door meeting. They had not planned this. Epsilon 9 was not part of any active defense network. The hidden systems were relics from a decades-old contingency plan, long forgotten by most. Yet somehow it had worked better than any modern fortress. The director leaned back in his chair and said only, "We underestimated the outliers." But on Epsilon 9, none of that mattered. Carl filed a requisition for replacement drone parts, just in case. Leo fixed a broken harvester and joked about adding armor plating for style. Maya crossbred a new strain of wheat that could grow in ion-rich soil, a side effect of the battle's atmospheric changes. Helen ran diagnostics on the Linden and found that the nanoweave armor had self-repaired most of the microfractures. Life went on. The conquered envoys stayed for 2 more days. They walked the colony, spoke with residents, and even shared a meal of algae stew and reconstituted bread. Before they left, Vex turned to Carl and said, "Your people do not boast. That is rare in this galaxy." Carl just nodded. "We don't need to." When the Wayfarer lifted off, it carried more than data. It carried a story, and stories once told cannot be untold. Across the stars, species began to wonder. If Earth's weakest colony could do this, what were the others hiding? Were there more like Epsilon 9? Quiet outposts with teeth? Sleeping giants in farmers' clothes? The truth was there weren't. Epsilon 9 was alone in its setup, but the myth was stronger than fact. And in the galaxy, perception shaped reality. Back on the red-dusted world, no one cared about myths. They cared about clean air filters, full water tanks, and healthy crops. They had fought not for glory, but for tomorrow, and tomorrow had come. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the domes, Carl stood outside again. He looked up at the stars, not with fear, but with quiet watchfulness. He knew peace was temporary, but so was war, and as long as they were ready, they would be safe. The galaxy might never understand how a colony of farmers won a war in 15 minutes. But Epsilon 9 didn't need them to. Part 5. Time passed on Epsilon 9 like it always had. Slow, steady, and without fanfare. The battle became a memory, not a monument. No statues were built. No holidays declared. The only reminder was a small dent in Dome 12 where a piece of Krellian shrapnel had landed, and even that was patched within a week. Life returned to its rhythm. Water checks at dawn, algae harvests at noon, quiet evenings under the red sky. The people did not speak much about what happened. They did not need to. They had lived it, but the galaxy had not forgotten. Trade ships began to appear in orbit more often. Not the usual freighters hauling spare parts or nutrient paste, but sleek diplomatic vessels with polished hulls and curious crews. They came from species that had once ignored human space, now drawn by the story of the colony that won in 15 minutes. They did not ask for weapons or secrets. They asked for tea, and conversation. Carl Briggs received them all the same way, with a cup of reconstituted coffee and a seat in the comms hub. He never gave speeches. He never explained tactics. When asked how they did it, he would just say, "We don't start fights, but we finish them." That phrase spread faster than any official report. It was carved into ship logs, quoted in council halls, whispered in cantinas across 3 sectors. One day, a young envoy from the Virel Collective, a species known for their rigid military doctrine, arrived alone. He was barely older than the colony's schoolchildren, wide-eyed and nervous. He sat across from Carl and asked, "How do you teach your people to fight like that?" Carl looked at him for a long moment. Then he called Leo over. Leo wiped his hands on a rag and sat down. Carl asked him, "When was the last time you fired a weapon?" Leo thought. "Never." The envoy blinked. "Then how—" "We don't train to fight," Carl said gently. "We train to fix things, to understand systems, to keep our home running. When the attack came, we didn't become soldiers. We just used what we knew." The envoy left that evening with more questions than answers, but he also left with something else: respect. Back on Earth, the Strategic Defense Directorate quietly updated its protocols. They stopped labeling colonies as low priority. They began reviewing old contingency plans, dusting off forgotten files, and sending subtle updates to remote outposts. Not orders, just suggestions. A new line of code here, a hidden panel there. Nothing obvious. Just enough to give others a chance should they ever need it. But Earth never admitted Epsilon 9 was part of a plan. Officially, it was a fluke. Unofficially, it was a lesson. Meanwhile, on the colony itself, nothing changed. Helen Cho still flew the Linden on supply runs. She avoided Krellian space, not out of fear, but because it was inefficient. Maya Ruiz's new wheat strain thrived, its roots drawing nutrients from the ion-rich soil left by the battle. It grew faster and stronger than any before. She shared seeds with passing traders who planted them on their own worlds. In time, Epsilon wheat became known for its resilience. Leo built a new drone, not for war, but for weather monitoring. It hovered over the flats, tracking dust storms and solar flares. He let the school kids name it. They called it Whisper. Children grew up hearing the story of the 15-minute war, but not as a tale of violence. As a lesson in readiness. In school, they still practiced the maintenance drills. They opened panels, ran diagnostics, and learned how systems connected. They were taught that protecting home wasn't about weapons. It was about knowing how things worked, and caring enough to keep them working. Years later, when a small pirate crew tried to raid a supply drop near Epsilon 9, they found the same quiet efficiency. No warning shots, no threats. Just a sudden loss of engine power, scrambled comms, and a gentle nudge from unseen drones that guided their ship into a harmless orbit until they agreed to leave. They never came back. The Krellians never returned either. Their empire began to shrink not from defeat but from fear. Other species, inspired by Epsilon 9's example, started building their own hidden defenses. Not flashy, not loud, but smart. The galaxy became quieter, not because wars ended, but because no one wanted to test the quiet places again. Carl Briggs grew older. His hair turned fully gray. His hands shook a little when he fixed the air recyclers. But he still walked the domes every morning, checking on crops, chatting with neighbors, making sure the colony hummed along. He never called himself a hero. He was just a man who loved his home. One evening, as he sat outside watching the stars, Helen joined him. She handed him a cup of coffee. They sat in silence for a while. "You think they'll ever understand?" she asked. "Who?" "The rest of the galaxy," Carl smiled. "They don't need to. We do." And that was enough. Epsilon 9 remained on the edge of the map, small and unremarkable to those who only looked at data. But to those who knew the truth, it was a warning wrapped in peace, a fortress dressed as a farm, a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. The story of Earth's weakest colony spread not through broadcasts or banners, but through actions. Through the way human outposts began to hold their ground without drama, through the quiet confidence in every handshake, every trade deal, every border crossing. Humanity did not boast. They did not threaten. They simply lived and made it clear that anyone who disturbed that peace would find more than they bargained for. And somewhere, in the endless dark between stars, 1,000 quiet colonies listened to the silence and waited, ready not for war, but for the chance to protect what they loved. That was the real victory. Not the 15 minutes of battle, but the peace that followed. And on Epsilon 9, peace was everything.